talk a little bit about your military experience.
Today's date is December the
30th.
30th, 2005, and I've been asked by George to say something about my military experience. Actually, I had never thought of going into the military. Thought never crossed my mind until, of course, Pearl Harbor. We were all at third entry of Henry Hall in Princeton on December the 7th. And I think we were all listening to WNEW, some of the recordings out of New York, jazz recordings, and they broke in and they said that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. But none of us had a clue where Pearl Harbor was. In fact, one of the radio announcers didn't know either, said he thought it was in the state of Washington. It created really pandemonium. Grandfather called me very quickly, and he was concerned that he'd heard that so many of the young men were thinking of going into service, and some of our classmates did. They went right from December the 8th, went right into military service, or as soon as they could. Grandfather sent me a wire and said, which I have, that he had a seat for me to sit in the House of Representatives the next day when President Roosevelt would declare war. So I went down. I went down to Washington, but before that, the campus was in a state of complete confusion. Parents were calling their children and telling them, "Don't enlist." Many of the young men did enlist or tried to enlist. And I guess in the excitement and frustration, we started a bonfire, which was 2 stories high, with an outhouse on the top of it. We found an outhouse and put it on that. And it's made a huge fire. Nobody disturbed us. It didn't do any damage. It was just a way of releasing all the, I guess, excitement, frustration, or whatever it may be. I went down to the United States Senate and listened to Roosevelt make that magnificent speech. It was very, very short, as you know. And then the draft had already been passed a month or so before Pearl Harbor. And of course, in anticipation of the dangers of what we were facing. So I was granted I think it's a 2A student deferment because I was an engineer. And at the time I was in aeronautical engineering. So we went back, when I got back from Washington, of course we went back into our classes. All of the roommates stayed together. Nobody enlisted right at that time. Gordon Allen, Eddie Suplee were in the military science, so they were headed somewhere. Frank Broderick, who was the editor of the Daily Princetonian, of course had to put out editorials and did a magnificent job in that respect. Stu Skinner was another engineer, that's another roommate. And the two of us, shortly thereafter, realized that we were sooner or later going to get into military service, applied for the aircraft maintenance program, which was run by the Army Air Corps, and on a field out in Illinois. And both of us were accepted. In the meanwhile, we accelerate our studies to try to get out to be finished. My draft board continued to give me a student deferment, but as I got close to graduation in June of 1943, they became very restless, and I think they were concerned because here's the son of a United States Senator who is not going into military service. So rather than waiting for me to graduate, I was advised that I would go into military service. I have the date, I think it's the 2nd or 3rd of June of 1943. That was before graduation. In fact, it was before I took my last exam. At that point in time, under the acceleration program, Eddie Supplee and Gordon Allen had already gone into field artillery, and they were already out in Oklahoma in that respect in the military service. Wilson Pritchett had volunteered early, and he was in the Navy, and he would have been stationed in of all places, Guadalcanal, during part of the activity out there. So when it got to myself, I realized that I wasn't going to be able to finish college because I was going to miss the last exam and certainly miss graduation. Well, I managed to bunch everything together and got all the exams finished except a course in meteorology. And our senior project for aeronautical engineering had been to design an airplane. And I had done all of the drafting work on that and some of the research on it as well. Because I was pretty good at drafting because I'd worked for the Bethlehem shipyards the summer before. And in their drafting department had done some very good three-dimensional drawing in regard to cargo ships. But so at any rate, I'm trying to finish up this project before the military service comes. And it turned out I worked 2 or 3 nights without much sleep, and I found that the night before I had to turn it in, that the landing gear, which had been designed by another member of the team, wouldn't contract. In other words, if I worked it out as it came up, 2 bars would cross and it would not contract. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, I had to design a whole new landing gear, design it stress-wise, and draw it. And actually did it. Got the project in on time. And one of the professors there was a former Boeing engineer, urged me to get my system patented because it was a unique way of landing gear being retracted. Needless to say, none of that ever happened because the next day I had a meteorology exam, and the next day after that I was going to be drafted. So I hadn't had a chance to work for the meteorology exam, and a good friend, Bobby Rigger, knew that I hadn't had any time to review it, so the 2 of us sat down in one of the clubs, and Bobby said, "Look, George, I know you haven't had a chance to study this at all, what you've been under. So why don't you go over with me last year's exam? That'll give you an idea of the feel for it." So we went over the exam. I'm barely able to stay awake. So we get through the reading over the last year's exam. I go back and I sleep like a rock. Get up the next morning, go in for my last exam, last day of college, and the professor was a Norwegian. And gentlemen, he says, "I'm terribly embarrassed. I didn't get the exam ready. I'll have to give you last year's exam." So at that point, Randy Meyer, who was also graduating, and I was rowing with him at the time, we decided to hell with it. So we went down to the cousins, they each got a quart of beer, and sat in the back of the class, finished off a quart of beer, finished off the exam, left feeling no pain at all, got on the train, and that was the last I heard of that. Now, as far as the course is concerned, I must have passed the exam because I got a 2+ or something like that, so I guess I could remember enough the night before. So back to military service, I got a good night's sleep after that, and it turned out at the 5th Regiment Army for my physical exam, which was a joke because, as we remarked, all you had to be breathing and reasonably warm, and you were in. So we're a long line of us walking around with skivvies, not undershorts and nothing else. And of course I passed, and I think everybody else passed. So then we have one more day before we turn out at Penn Station and we go off to military service.